Okay, good afternoon, members of the audience, and welcome to Griffith Observatory. Good afternoon to the people on our live stream and YouTube channels who are watching this live. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for those of you who are, I know battling traffic on a Saturday is a terrible thing. So thank you all you brave and intrepid travelers who came up to join us here for our celebration of Apollo 12. At Griffith Observatory, we are celebrating each and every Apollo mission. I think a lot of people saw on the news and participated in, maybe went to some Apollo 11 celebrations. And a lot of times Apollo 12 just gets overlooked. So we're here to tell the wonderful stories of Apollo 12. We had the previous program went into some details. Maybe some of you didn't know that Apollo 12 got struck by lightning on its way up and the panel went blank and the alarms flashed just seconds after launch. A little scary there. There are a lot of wonderful stories. So if you missed it, or if any of you missed it, it will be posted live or posted after the fact on our YouTube channel, and so we encourage you to go back and see some of the earlier programs today. I'm Dr. Laura Danley. I'm the curator of Griffith Observatory. I'm happy to welcome you here today, and I'm particularly happy to welcome our speaker, Alan Ladwig, who is going to share with us a little bit about our vision, and by our, I mean our collective vision about what it might be like to travel in space. As you can see here, we have talks all day. We had a little talk about are the Apollo missions to the moon, were they hoaxes? No, they weren't. We really went there. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version. No, not a hoax, really real. People walked on the moon. And then, as I mentioned earlier, details of the Apollo 12 mission. Our last talk this afternoon at 2:30 is going to be just a panel discussion about our future on the moon. Are we headed back? Well, in fact, there are plans. How many of you are aware that there are plans within NASA right now called the Artemis program to send us back to the moon? So the majority of you are not aware of that, and that is my experience every time I ask this question. So we're going to tell you a little bit about NASA's plans to take us back to the moon, whether they're reasonable, feasible, or pie in the sky, what our long-term vision of the moon might be. And joining us on that panel as well will be today's guest, Alan Ladwig. Last little thing I want to say is all that music we've been playing, I've had a couple questions about it. It is the number 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and number 1 song of this week in 1969 when the Apollo 12 mission was taking place. So that's what we're listening to out there. So now, with no further ado, I want to introduce our speaker today, Alan Ladwig. Alan Ladwig is now a consultant and author in the space business, but he's been doing space, working in the space exploration and industry field for 35 years, 40, he says, 40 years, a long time. He's had 3 different times at NASA. The first as just a normal norm. We'll get to your abnormal NASA life in a minute, but as a regular old NASA employee, working in education, working in exploration, working in space flight systems. But then that was in the 80s. Then in the 90s, he was brought back to NASA as an appointee from the Clinton administration as part of the, as the head of the Office of Plans, Policy and Plans. And then in the next decade, back with the Obama administration specializing, I think, in education, correct? In public outreach. So he's been in it forever. He knows everybody, has seen it all himself. And in particular has been aware of and a proponent of the idea that space is for all of us. And so he worked with Sally Ride in her educational institution and now has written this book to share with you. I want to just hold it up so you and the audience can see this lovely book, See You in Orbit, Our Future in Space. We have copies at the bookstore, and after this talk and after the next talk, Alan will be out in at a table in the gallery, the Edge of Space Gallery, signing them. So we hope you'll consider purchasing one and meeting Alan and getting a signature. So with that, Alan, please tell us about our Dream of Spaceflight.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, Laura. Thank you so much.
And the book covers 70 years worth of history. You know, why do you think you're might someday get to fly in space? Because for the past 70 years, everybody told us we were all going to get to fly in space. Government officials, aerospace companies, the media, everybody said your rocket to ride, or your trip into space is just a rocket away. So we've all had this expectation of wanting to go. Because it covers so much history in the book, I'm not going to get into all of it, but I wanted to focus mainly on what was being said about space tourism and space travel for the average citizen during the years before and after Apollo 12. The true space, and it's always been, I've not been in space myself. I did work for the Zero Gravity Corporation, and I did get to do a lot of parabolic flights. Highly recommended. If you don't get to go all the way to space, this is the next best thing. So, where did this dream of space come from? It's said that the true space dream began in 1865. That's the time frame of the Civil War, for goodness sakes. And there was about 4 different books, science fiction books, written in Europe, the most famous one of which was Jules Verne, From Earth to the Moon, that started talking about traveling in space. And that's the rocket ship that was on the cover of the book. Then in 1903, a Russian mathematician, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, wrote a paper called Investigation of Outer Space with Reactive Devices. It was in 1903. What else was happening in 1903? The Wright brothers are flying. Well, we're just learning how to fly an airplane, and Konstantin Tsiolkovsky is talking about space stations. And this particular one was a 300-foot-long passenger rocket. He called it a rocket train, and he predicted it would be launched in 2017. Then we go forward another decade to Robert Goddard, the father of American rocketry. And when he was just talking about rockets, he hadn't built them yet, but just talking about a rocket to the moon, he had a paper called A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. Within a year of that paper being published, he got hundreds of letters from citizens around the world volunteering to fly in a rocket to the moon that hadn't even been built yet. He was not actually happy with all the volunteers. He wanted to be left alone. And then the third person that's very important is a German, Hermann Oberth. And he wrote a self-published book called Rocketry into Interplanetary Space in 1923. And he was big in helping start the German Society of Space Travel that Wernher von Braun was a member of. A lot of the German engineers that later came to America through Operation Paperclip were all members of that society. Whereas Goddard kept a low profile, Oberth wanted to go out and talk about space to anybody that would listen. And he actually was a consultant to the first space science fiction movie called Fritz Lang's Girl in the Moon. And he was a technical consultant, and Lang wanted him to build a rocket that they could launch at the premiere of the movie. That part never worked out. But it was an early indication of wanting to get the public more engaged about space travel. Then we go forward into the 50s. In 1950, at the Hayden Planetarium in New York, Willy Ley, a German historian, was speaking one night on a topic called the conquest of space. And they decided to set up a little gimmick in the lobby of the planetarium, just outside the lecture hall. They had a booth, and they had it where you could sign up for an interplanetary tour reservation. Where do you want to go? Moon, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. You could get to the moon, they predicted, in 9.5 hours. Mars in 75 days. I don't know what's taking NASA so long, if we could have got there. Saturn in over 1,000 days. Over the next 4 to 5 years, this auditorium held 800 people. Over the next 3 to 4 years, they got 22,000 people submitted these applications to go. And in return, they were given this card, and then with a projected date was going to be in 1970, I think they said. Now, why do people want to go? I think it's best summed up, or one of the good reasons summed up, was from a 16-year-old girl that wrote to the Hayden, Ruby Massengale from Mississippi. She thought she'd be 32 in 1975, and she said she didn't want to go for selfish reasons like money, fame, or adventure, but was instead interested in progress for all mankind. Ruby captured the essence of what motivates many who hold the dream of space travel to this day when she concluded, it seems like this longing is actually part of me. Then we shoot forward a little more to it's in 1960, and at a conference in Stockholm, the International Astronautical Federation, a aerospace engineer named Max Hunter gave a paper on the direct operating cost analysis of nuclear spaceships. Now, at the time, we were mainly looking at chemical rockets. He proposed a nuclear spaceship that he said could put cargo into space for $1 a pound. At the time, it was like $20,000 to $30,000 a pound. And that people, if you wanted to go, it was going to be a little more for people, anywhere from $500 to $5,000 a pound to go. Now, Time magazine picked up on that paper and wrote an article. And they titled the story, Sing Song Merry-Go-Round, Here We Go Off to the Moon, Oh. The article didn't specify when, but left the impression that it wouldn't be long before space travelers would be able to suit up and fly right. Cost of a round-trip ticket to the moon, the article concluded, would be $900, about $40 less than the current first-class jet airfare from New York to Paris and back. Those were big visions back then. Then we go forward a few more years, 1965. In 65, again, this is before any of the Apollo missions, but the National Geographic Society there was a proposal that came to NASA and said, how about if we put a National Geographic writer, photographer on a Gemini mission? Now, if you were here for the previous presentation, you saw the Gemini. That was for 2 astronauts. We had only flown, I think, 2 or 3 Gemini missions at that time, but they thought it'd be swell to put a photographer on one of those missions. Now, if you know anything about the early history of the test pilots, you can imagine what they thought of that idea. So needless to say, that didn't happen, but the reason the people that proposed it thought public interest and identification would be stimulated to a much greater degree than from previous flights because the passengers would be more like the public, not a highly trained astronaut. People would feel that they were getting the straight, unvarnished story and could be made to feel that they are getting more direct personal benefit for their money. Now, at this time, we learned about space through the Life magazine articles and all of the as told by the astronauts. There was a whole series of them. And so evidently those stories were somewhat varnished, and we needed an unvarnished version to go forward. Then you go forward to 1967. Again, 2 years before Apollo 12. But at an American Astronautical Society conference, one of the engineers named Kraft Ericke, he was a German, he came over with Operation Paperclip. He had a panel at the conference on space tourism. And along with him was Baron Hilton of the Hilton Hotel. And this was just 4 months after the Apollo 1 fire that killed the 3 astronauts. But here we are already talking about space tourism. And what Kraft Ericke said, the primary attractions which lie in the nature of space and in the lure of other worlds do not only affect engineers, scientists, and astronauts. The space program had a deeper purpose than to watch astronauts in orbit. For him, the deeper purpose would be realized when a broad swath of humanity was living and working in space. So he was followed by Baron Hilton. And I mean, this was amazing back when you think about it in 67 for somebody from a hotel being at an aerospace conference. That was a really unique thing. And Baron Hilton envisioned a resort complex with 100 guest rooms, nuclear-powered kitchens, free dry dining, wall-to-wall televisions, and, of course, a cocktail lounge. As Hilton reminded the conference delegates, if you think we're not going to have a cocktail lounge, you don't know Hilton. Or travelers, enter the Galaxy Lounge. Enjoy a martini, see the stars. Then we go since 1968, again, a year before Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. And what happened in 68? Those of you that are old enough to remember, the movie 2001 Space Odyssey came out. And what was the identifying thing that got everybody so excited? It was this shuttle here, which had the insignia of Pan Am, a Pan Am Clipper. And they were going into the space station, and inside there was a Hilton hotel. So Pan Am got the idea that because of all the public interest in spaceflight, they created what they called the first Moon Flights Club. And over a 3-year period from 1968 to 71, guess how many people signed up? 93,000. And they all got these cards, again, their reservation card. And when I was the head of the spaceflight participant program at NASA, people used to send me the copies of these cards or the Hayden Planetarium card. Could they please turn that in for a flight on the space shuttle? Then we go forward to 1969, now the year of Apollo 12. And that's when Arthur C. Clarke, who you all know is the famous science fiction writer and was considered to be kind of a guru of the future, he said just before the Apollo 12 flight, the time will come when the cost of a lunar journey may be comparable to that of a round trip around the world jet flights today. It would be just our luck that we'd have to book a flight a month in advance, depart on a Tuesday. Some restrictions would apply. We'd be stuck in a middle seat, and they'd lose our luggage on the way to Mars. Then we go forward to Apollo 12. Then we go forward to Apollo 12 itself, which, as we heard earlier, was launched on November 14th. But it was the 6th human mission, 2nd mission to the moon. But there was all this interest in people. And then NASA was already thinking about, well, what were they going to do after Apollo? They'd only had 2 Apollo missions. They were already thinking into the future. So President Nixon created a space task group that was supposed to take a look at what will we do beyond Apollo. And Vice President Spiro Agnew was the head of it, and the NASA administrator at the time, Thomas Paine, was much more active in trying to decide what the future for NASA should be than his predecessor, Jim Webb. Jim Webb felt it was up to the politicians to tell him what to do. Paine wanted to tell the politicians what the opportunities were. So from the Space Task Group, what they came up with was a robust agenda was developed, complete with space shuttles, space station in both Earth and lunar orbit, a lunar base, and human flights to Mars in the 1980s as the next logical step towards our destiny in space. The majority of the public and the political leadership, however, turned a deaf ear on these fanciful and expensive ventures. Instead, they focused on the space shuttle. And what people started to think of the space shuttle, that this was going to be the way that all of the rest of us were going to get to fly. An article in the Air Force and Space Digest magazine said, space engineers claim that the new vehicle would usher in the day when astronauts would be as numerous as commercial jet pilots. Flights into space would take off daily, and virtually any young man who yearns to voyage into space will be able to do so at some point in his life. And then a senior NASA official said about the shuttle, to achieve the desired economy, it will be necessary to operate this transportation system in the successful jet transport mode. Our space shuttle will probably take off from major airports with little or no noise. They also thought that the shuttle would bring the launch cost down to $50 a pound, perhaps $25 a pound, and that we would be exporting space shuttles and would help our positive balance of payments. That didn't happen. So then, and let me mention one other thing. In that time frame is when I first became a space advocate. I joined a group called the Committee for the Future, and they had a proposal called Project Harvest Moon. And they announced this in 1970, just a few months after Apollo 12. And the mission of Harvest Moon was to utilize surplus Saturn V rockets and lunar modules for a citizen's mission to the moon. And that they would have 2 astronauts go up, set up a base, set up experiments, and collect 400 pounds of moon rocks to bring back for sale to the public. NASA wasn't big on this idea and kind of poo-pooed it, although a congressional hearing was held on it, and a bill was offered to make sure that NASA set aside some hardware for this to happen. Needless to say, it never happened. So then we go into the 70s, and this, what I call the Space Shuttle Era, from the 70s to 2011, 2011, was when Nixon gave the NASA the go-ahead for the shuttle in January of 72. This was a year after Pan Am shut down their Moon Flights Club, 3 years after Apollo 12. Originally, space shuttle missions were supposed to be 60 flights a year. And over time, that dropped down to 50, to 40, to 20, to 10. And that at the beginning, they said it would only need 3 astronauts. And it could take 7 people, so that meant 4 seats for passengers, people like you and I. Well, that didn't last long. All of a sudden, it was up. Oh, what did I do there? All of a sudden, it went from 3 astronauts up to 4. And then, of course, over time, look, we're not taking any passengers. All we need are astronauts on board. George Low, the deputy administrator of NASA, though, in the mid-70s, as the shuttle's still being developed, hasn't flown yet, in development, and he wanted to do something to excite the public about spaceflight and about the shuttle. Some advisory committees that said, you know what, the public doesn't know what's going on, they don't understand this, you need to do something kind of exciting. So he thought about the notion of flying Philippe Cousteau on a space shuttle mission. And Philippe was the son of Jacques, and what they hoped was that he would go up, experience space, come back and create a movie or some kind of an educational endeavor that would bring the excitement of space to people the way the Cousteaus had brought the excitement of the oceans. And then as a backup, they said if Cousteau can't do it, maybe Walter Cronkite should go. And y'all, those of you that are old enough know Walter Cronkite was the guy that was in love with the space program. He cried when Apollo 11 landed, and he wanted to go himself. Well, ultimately, it was decided that you can't just pick one person. There has to be a process. So they set up what they called a unique personality study. And as in the book I say, he's not very good looking, but he's got a unique personality. And so what they came up with was, by virtue of his occupation or organizational affiliation, and we should send somebody for the purpose of communicating. They said the best communicator would be someone like a news reporter, a popular scientist, not to be confused with an eminent scientist, a politician, not to be confused with a prominent statesman, that never happens, a layman, a space science student, a prominent transportation figure, an artist, which could include a poet, a painter, and writers, or a humanitarian, or an entertainer. And that study came out in the mid-70s, about 1977, I think it was. And again, because the shuttle was behind schedule, because it was over budget, the whole notion of flying anybody that other than astronauts got shelved and put on the back shelf for many years. Well, when did it come up again? It came up again in 1981. That's when James Beggs became the administrator. He came after the first space shuttle flight was in April of 1981. And when Beggs came, he got overrun with volunteers wanting to fly in the shuttle. Self-appointed VIPs, entertainers, movie stars, everybody was contacting him. I want to fly in the shuttle. So he turned to the NASA Advisory Committee and said, we are without a procedure. You know, how do we deal with all these people so that he didn't have to talk to everyone that wanted to fly in the shuttle? And that led to the creation of the Informal Task Force for the study and selecting private citizens in space. And they started their work in July '82, which was during the landing of STS-4. So we'd only had 4 shuttle flights, and those first 4 flights were considered flight test. And at that event, at the landing at Edwards Air Force Base, Reagan decided we are now in business. he authorized Challenger, which was on the runway on top of the Boeing 747, to take off to go to Florida. The Columbia had just landed, and he was actually standing on the wing of the Space Shuttle Enterprise. Enterprise was a test vehicle that was put on top of 747. They used it for landing tests. Never went into space. I always thought the Star Trek people kind of blew it early by demanding the first orbiter be named Enterprise. It was supposed to be named Constitution, and there was a big letter campaign to President Gerald Ford, and he went ahead and named it Enterprise. But it never made it to space. I thought that was a big mistake on their part. So the task force did their study for a year. They talked to people all around the country, opinion leaders, astronauts. They visited all the NASA human spaceflight centers. And then they came out with a final report in 1983. And in their report, they said, ultimately, humans expect to live, work, and vacation in space or on the moon or Mars. Many want to do it immediately. Others recognize that technology and economics will limit such an experience to all but a small fraction of their compatriots, but hold out hope that their children or grandchildren may someday get to fly and may be able to participate. And so they focused on, well, what is the purpose of flying a civilian on the shuttle? And they tagged it to a communication. Again, people had complained that, well, you know, the astronauts they're good people, but they're not very good communicators. They're not expressive enough about what it's really like to be in space. They were too reserved. So the thought was, all right, let's have a communicator. And the three categories was an observer communicator, like a television broadcaster, a print journalist, or an educator. And ultimately, an internal NASA committee then decided that the first opportunity should go for a teacher. And I was the manager of that program. And in July 1984, President Reagan stood up at an education event in Washington, D.C., and that's when he declared the first private citizen should be one of America's finest, a teacher. This was a great opportunity for teachers because at that time, teachers felt underappreciated, as they still do today. Their pay was lousy, and this gave a tremendous boost to educators all around the country. Once we announced the rules for applications, we got a little over 14,000 applications that filled out a 14-page document, and there were 2 winners per state and overseas territories, District of Columbia. We ended up with 114 state finalists. They all came to D.C. in June of 1985, and then in July, we went back to the White House where Krista McAuliffe was named the teacher in space. And Barbara Morgan was her backup. Krista was a high school teacher, social science teacher from New Hampshire. Barbara Morgan was an elementary teacher from Idaho. And so when they went down to Johnson Space Center to be trained, up until that point, backups weren't given the full range of training that the primary received. So there was a payload specialist program that flew people from industry. Their backups didn't get the whole experience. Well, thankfully, NASA gave Barbara that experience. Krista was named to the STS-51L crew, and we know what happened then. It was a bad day when, in January of '86, when Krista and the rest of the crew perished during the launch of the Challenger mission. At that time, we had started a journalist in space program. In fact, I had been down at Kennedy for the launch, with all the delays, had to go back to DC for a meeting on the journalist in space program, and then the accident happened, and needless to say, we didn't have a meeting that day. But we went ahead with the journalists competition, and they had picked 100 finalists, or national finalists, and they reduced that to 40 finalists. And the next step would have been reducing that group to 5. Well, over the next several months, it was determined that we just couldn't go forward. We wouldn't go beyond the 40, and the program was canceled. Anybody want to guess what the third category might have been? Any thoughts? We were looking at an artist, and that one gave me no ends of headaches, because how do you pick an artist? You know, we had external organizations that helped us with the teacher criteria, the journalist criteria, another organization. There isn't like an overarching artist organization. So I did end up talking to the National Endowments of Arts. They wanted to help with the challenge. We were going to talk to museum curators, deans of art at colleges, but because of the accident, that didn't get much farther than the talking stage. So let's skip ahead then from the accident, because the whole thing got put on hold. We weren't going to focus on any private citizens, although Barbara Morgan did get to fly, but she flew as an actual astronaut. We wanted to get away from the criticism that space was too dangerous for a teacher, so NASA enrolled her as an actual astronaut, and she ended up flying to the space station on STS-118. She waited a long time. She entered the astronaut corps in 1998 and didn't fly till I think it was 2008. So let's jump forward then, because nothing's happening with citizens in space for quite a while. So the question is, are we there yet? You know, when you go for a trip somewhere with your kids, what do they say? Are we there yet? Well, are we there yet? Well, here's some relevance of hope. You've got Virgin Galactic that won the X Prize. The X Prize was announced in May of 1986, and this was going to be a prize for the first company that could launch a vehicle into suborbital space. It had to be able to carry 3 people. They only had to have 1 pilot on the actual mission, and then go into space, come back, and turn it around and fly it again in 2 weeks. About, there must have been 10, 12 different companies were trying to pursue that, but it was Virgin Galactic and Burt Rutan from the Mojave area that ended up winning when they won the $10 million Ansari X Prize. Now, at the time, they said that someone would, when they announced it in '86, it was announced that someone would win within 3 to 5 years, and 1 or 2 years after that, commercial tickets would be available. We didn't quite make that one. Then, when Rutan and Richard Branson won the prize, they said the first flight would be in mid-2010. Again, we didn't quite make that one. Now Virgin says they're going to fly sometime next year. And I think they're probably now on a schedule that may very well happen. They have a spacecraft that flies up underneath this carrier plane, and then this is where the passengers will be. And once they get up to 50,000 feet, the spacecraft comes off, and then rockets ignite, takes it into a suborbital arc, much like Alan Shepard did in 1961. And Virgin, I can't seem to get a straight answer on this. They have anywhere from 600 to 800 people that have made reservations. The first ones that came in started at $200,000. It's now up to $250,000. And they think that once we start flying, that number will increase. So again, they hope to fly next year. They can take 6 people, and this is kind of a vision of what it looks like inside this rocket. Now, another one, are we there yet, is Blue Origin, owned by Jeff Bezos. And Blue Origin has a different technology. They have a rocket that takes off, and then the passenger are in this capsule up at the top. So the rocket takes off, the capsule comes off, the rocket lands to be used again, parachutes open up on the capsule, and then they land out in an open area. This is what theirs looks like inside. Now, Blue has not formally announced a price. They're not formally taking reservations yet, but it's assumed that they'll be in that $250,000 range, and that they could fly sometime in 2020 as well. To keep my book relevant, I'm kind of hoping the longer they delay, the better it is for me to be current. So we'll see where it goes. Now, the one other thing that did happen for tourism was the Russians. The Russians were more capitalistic than the Americans were, and they started flying people to their part of the International Space Station. Dennis Tito did this in 2001, and he was the first space tourist to the space station. NASA and the European Space Agency hated this. They didn't think that there should be these tourists mucking around up in the space station. And in fact, the head of the space station at the Johnson Space Center didn't want Tito coming anywhere near the American side of the space station, which was a little petty. But over time, over the next 9 years, 6 other people flew, and the prices went, I think Tito's was around 25 million, and then people like Richard Garriott, whose father, Owen Garriott, was an Apollo astronaut, flew on the Skylab mission, became the first father-son to fly in space. And then Anush Ansari, an Iranian-American, who was the first female space tourist, and then she came forward to put the remaining money that was needed for the $10 million X Prize. So they all flew, but then because the shuttle ended, NASA had no way to get their astronauts to the space station. So Russia stepped forward and said, we'll sell you seats on our Soyuz capsule. And so they withdrew from flying tourists because they needed the seats for Americans, although they're starting to talk about reviving that again, especially because soon we will have our own capability to get to the space station, not a government vehicle, but a private vehicle. And this is the Dragon 2 on the left, which is built by SpaceX and Elon Musk. Surely everybody's heard of Elon Musk by now, a man of great vision. He's got some what he calls aspirational goals. I never listen too closely to the years he says he's going to do things, because it's usually harder than it sounds. But his capsule, Dragon 2, just had a successful static firing yesterday or the day before. And then Boeing has the space liner, and each of these can carry up to 6 people to the space station. Got to move forward. So where is this all going to go? Citizens of the moon? Who knows? Laura and I both were at a conference this past week where this got a lot of discussion. The space advocates in the room think that there's going to be a lot of people living on the moon by 2029. I'm a little skeptical on that. But 50 years after Apollo 12, when Pete Conrad proclaimed, "Whoopee, man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me." Well, we all now have our eyes set on what small and long steps will unfold in the not-so-distant future. And why is this going to happen? Why do we want to do this? People want to experience what the woman that got me into the space program through the Committee for the Future, Barbara Hubbard, called the evolutionary spiral. She believes we are moving consciously higher on a plane, and that space is going to help us see things with a new perspective. Author Frank White calls it the overview effect, where when astronauts are up in space, they look down at Earth, they don't see any borders, they come back with a renewed consciousness about what life could be all about, or what astronaut Ron Garan calls the orbital perspective. I want to end with a quote from a Australian professor of tourism, and why she feels people want to go. Space tourism falls in the category of what is known as transformational services, which are consumed not just to satisfy basic survival needs. Transformational services enable people to rethink and reset their value system, their priorities, and the way they think, to learn, to self-develop, to change their attitudes, mindsets, or their behavior or perception about certain things. So this is what drives, if you go back and look at the letters people wrote to Robert Goddard, the Hayden Planetarium people, the people that wrote to me when I was the head of the Space Flight Participant Program, that's the kind of motivation and reason people always had. You could put the letters down from Goddard to the present, and you wouldn't be able to tell what year they were written, except the letters to Goddard had better penmanship. So this is what it's all about. I think we're still a ways from average citizens flying on an affordable and routine basis, but hope springs eternal. In the meantime, aim high, dream big, see you in orbit. And you can get the book in the gift store, and I'll be signing shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, because we have to reset for our next show, and he's in it, so there's not a lot of signing time, actually. So we won't take time for questions now, but thank you, and we'll be back in 20 minutes for his next talk, our Future on the Moon.